All right, AP Environmental. Today's lecture video is on topic 4.3. Again, we're still in Unit 4. So we've spent the first two um, topics of this chapter talking about soil and talking about how soil forms and why it's important. In this particular video, we're going to kind of talk briefly about soil testing, like what we're looking for in soil, the composition of soil, kind of what it's made out of, and also some of the properties of soil. So let's first kind of talk about testing. When we um, are looking at soil, or when, like, let's say a soil ecologist or a soil scientist is looking at soil, there's basically three things that they can kind of test for. One is the biological components of the soil. Another one is they can run like chemical tests on the soil. There's a variety of different things that they can test for. And then finally, there's physical like examinations of soil to see like what the texture of the soil is, and what plants might be good to grow in that soil, or let's say for example they want to construct a skyscraper. Like the soil that they use and that they're going to dig into is actually kind of an important thing. Like if you're going to build houses and concrete structures, you want to have a certain type of soil to build that stuff in. So all of these things are kind of important, but we're going to talk about them kind of individually today. All right, so biological testing of soil. Um, just kind of looking here at this picture, kind of I guess, sort of a soil food web. When we're looking at the biology of the soil, we're looking at the living components or the living things that sort of impact the soil. And one thing that we have to remember is that soil is dynamic. It changes all the time. The soil that's in your backyard, is not exactly the same as what it was a year ago. And one of the reasons why is because the living things that live in that soil have changed. One of the things that soil scientists look at is they look at these organisms that are living there and how they change over time. Like, for example, let's say a soil scientist is studying some soil, at least for the biological components of it. Let's say that the particular type of soil that they're looking at has a lot of fungi in it. It has a lot of funguses in it, whatever. Um, and we know that funguses mainly act sort of as decomposers for the most part. So if there's a lot of fungi in the soil, we can probably make the conclusion that there's a lot of decomposition probably going on in that soil, which would lead to a lot of organic material, maybe in those upper layers of the soil. But let's say a year later, the scientist comes back and studies the same soil and finds out that maybe there's not as much fungus as there was a year ago. Well, that's going to have an impact on the quality of the soil, and it's going to impact the soil just by that living organism maybe not being there, maybe not being there in as much abundance as there used to be. But again, all of these living things do have an impact not only on the physical properties of the soil, but also the chemical properties of the soil. All right, now physical testing. The biggest thing that we kind of look at with soil when it comes to the physicality of soil is the texture of the soil. Now, texture is basically due to three different particles that are found in all soils. One of them is called sand. You've probably heard of sand. One of them is called clay. You've probably heard of clay. And the other one is called silt. Now, the difference between the three particles is basically their size. Okay. Sand particles compared to the other two, if you look at this picture down here, I think it kind of makes some sense. A sand particle is the largest of the three. We're comparing these to a piece of gravel, which is like a small pebble or a small rock. But sand particles are fairly large. They're greater than 0.05 millimeters. They get up to maybe 2 millimeters in diameter, or length or width or whatever. But they're the largest of the three. Then we have our silt particle, which is much smaller. You kind of see the comparison there as far as size goes. And then finally, we have a clay particle. Clay particles are extremely small. In fact, if we're using this scale here, they're basically invisible. So they are the smallest of the three particles. Make sure you know which particle is the largest, which one's the smallest. I'm not going to make you memorize these measurements, but just in general, know which one's the smallest, which one's the largest. Now, all soils, for the most part, have all three of these components. They're just in different percentages. One type of soil might have a high percentage of sand in it. Another soil might have a large percentage of clay in it, just depending on the soil type. All right. Now, because of these three particles and the texture of the soil, that leads to some different properties. One of the properties of soil is called porosity. Porosity is basically defined as the ability of soil to hold water. We also call that the water holding capacity. So here in this picture, we've got like this little lab setup, and we've got a little funnel in each one. We've got a little collecting beaker here in each one. And in each one of these funnels, we have a sample of pure clay, pure silt, and pure sand. And we do know that each one of those particles or each one of those substances is made up of a different size particle. Now, these particles, because they're different in size, or they have differences in sizes, that means that the space between the particles is different as well. So if we poured some water through each one of these funnels and just let the water drain into these beakers, we would be able to see which one of these particular soil components is better at holding water and which one is worse at holding water. You can probably see in the picture. Let's say we poured the water in at the same exact time. You can see that the sand allowed the water to drain through much faster than, let's say, the clay did. Okay, you can see that from the picture. So we can say that clay, in comparison to sand, has a much higher porosity. The porosity is the ability of the soil to hold water. So clay holds water much better than sand does. Okay, just by looking at the picture, you can probably tell that. Now, another term, or another property, I suppose, is called permeability. Permeability is defined as how easily water flows, or we call that percolates, through a soil. So again, you can kind of look at the picture, and if I says which of these three soils, has the highest permeability, which one has the lowest permeability? I mean, you would probably say that the sand, because the water went through it so quickly, would have the higher permeability. And again, the clay would have the lower permeability. And silt is kind of in the middle, right? So one thing I want you to kind of understand from this is that these two terms, they're they're kind of opposite of each other a little bit. I mean, if for example, let's say a soil has a high porosity, it's going to have a lower permeability. If a soil has a low porosity, it's going to have a higher permeability. All right, here's another picture that kind of shows us something kind of similar. Let's say, for example, over here on the left, you've got kind of a sandy soil, and over here on the right, you have more of a soil that has more of a higher clay content to it. So you can kind of see, for example, the sizes of these particles, right? The sand particles are much larger, and the clay particles are much smaller. So In the sand, if we poured water into this soil, that water would very easily percolate through the soil. So it has a high permeability, but it also has a low porosity because, again, that soil is sort of allowing that water to seep through quicker, all because the pores, the spaces in between the particles, are so much larger. Whereas over here on the right, here we have the clay particles, which are much smaller, and there's a lot of spaces, but they're really, really tiny. So if we pour that water into a clay soil, that clay soil has a high porosity. It holds the water much better because the water is not draining through as fast. So we say that it has a very low permeability. So I think this is a good picture to kind of look at and see kind of the extreme opposites of a sandy soil versus a clay soil when it comes to water retention, the ability to hold on to that water, or the likelihood that it's going to easily just seep through the soil. All right, now this is called the soil triangle. I want you to really pay attention to this because you're going to be asked to use this on quizzes and tests, and also on the AP test. I've never seen an AP exam for environmental that didn't have at least one question about the soil triangle. It'll probably have more than one. So we have to kind of make sure we understand how to use this. Now, the soil triangle is basically a way to determine the texture of a soil. And we said earlier that every soil, has a certain percentage of sand, a certain percentage of clay, and a certain percentage of silt. And if you know those numbers, if you know those percentages, then you can figure out what type of soil it is. Now, you don't have to memorize all the soil types. All right, you don't have to memorize their names, but you do have to know how to use this triangle to determine what type of soil it is. All right, so we're going to go ahead and use an example here. And this is a typical example that they might give you on an AP test. They might tell you, okay, let's say that you get a soil sample, and that sample is 30% clay, 60% silt, and 10% sand. Now, one thing that you'll notice about those is that they do add up to 100, right? Every soil does. It's just that, one soil versus another, those numbers may vary, those percentages may vary. So, what you've got to do is you just have to pick one of these percentages. It doesn't really matter which one you pick. I'm going to go ahead and start with clay. All right, so 30% clay. So if you look at this triangle, there's three sides to it. Find the clay side. Now I want you to notice how the numbers on the clay side, you see how they just kind of go horizontal like this, okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to find 30%, okay? And just kind of draw a line. I mean, you don't have to draw a line, but I mean, just like imagine there's our clay line. Okay, so at 30%, this is the line that we're looking at. So then you pick another percentage, let's say 60% silt. So now you go over to the silt side. And now notice how these numbers are kind of diagonal a little bit. They kind of angle down like this. So find your 60. And again, you've got your line here. Okay, notice where they intersect, those two red lines. And I'll be honest with you, really, you only have to do this for two lines. But anyway, we'll do the third one just for the example. So then we have 10% sand. So if you look on the bottom, notice how the numbers are angled this way. Okay, so find your 10%. There's your line. And again, you'll notice where all three intersect right at that little point right there. So what that tells us is that this particular soil, we can classify it as what we call a silty clay loam. Now, silty clay loams, compared to other soils, are good for some things, are not good for other things. But every soil type is sort of unique. A lot of times let's say, for example, in agriculture, you know, farmers are going to be growing certain types of crops. Well, I mean, there's so many different soil types. I mean, if you're going to grow corn, for example, corn might grow, let's say, for example, best in maybe this soil right here, like right in the middle. Whereas if you're going to grow soybeans, maybe soybeans grow best in, I don't know, this soil here. If you're going to grow, I don't know, green beans, maybe green beans grow best in this soil up here. So every soil is a little bit different. Again, they all differ in those textures, but you're going to have to, again, make sure you can use this triangle. Again, you're going to be given the percentages, or maybe I'll give you two and you got to figure out the third one. That's kind of easy to do. But again, you should be able to use this soil triangle. It's fairly simple. All right, last thing is chemical testing of the soil. Whenever we run chemical tests on soils, there's a lot of things that we could test for. One of the big things that we test for is nutrients. We in fact, you can go to like Home Depot or some lawn and garden store or something, and you can easily get little soil testing kits. They're maybe like 10, 15 bucks or something, and you can run tests on soil. You can test for nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. I think they have some for calcium as well. And you're just testing for the nutrients that are in the soil. Let's say you want to plant a garden or something. I mean, you want your soil to have nutrients in it, right? Especially like limiting nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, because plants need those things. So if your soil doesn't have those, then most likely you're going to have to add fertilizer to it, right? Because if plants don't have nitrogen, for example, they're not going to grow. So you would have to add nitrogen. That would be done again through kind of a fertilizer. If you test your soil and there's very high levels of these types of things, then chances are there's probably already been fertilizer added to the soil and you don't need to add any more. So that's kind of an important thing to know before you plant anything in the soil. Another thing that we can test for fairly easily is pH. The pH of the soil, that tests either for the acidity or the alkalinity, how basic the soil is. Fertilizers can actually increase the acidity of the soil. So if there's too much fertilizer being added, that would make the soil much more acidic than what it normally would be. And if a soil is too acidic, and by the way, if you don't know your pH scale, there it all is. Less, or I should say, greater than 7 is basic, less than 7 is acidic. But if a soil is too acidic or even too alkaline, that can impact the biology of the soil. That takes us back to our soil food web and all the little critters that live there. If it's too acidic or if it's too basic, then some of those organisms might die, or they might just migrate out of that soil and go somewhere else. So understand that there are things that can impact the acidity of soils, and this is one reason why soil ecologists kind of check soils for pH to see if there's anything that has changed. Let's say, for example, in July, a farmer tests his soil, and the soil has a pH of, I don't know, 6.5 or something. And then he comes back a month later and finds out that the pH is 5.5. Well, something has happened in that time. It could be a natural thing. It could be something more anthropogenic, like maybe acid rain, which we'll talk about down the road. Acid rain, for the most part, is caused by anthropogenic things. That could affect the pH of the soil. So make sure you understand again some things that we can test for when it comes to chemicals. All right, guys, that's it for me for today. Have a good day, and I will see you soon.